Hello, my name is Dave Mahalik. I'm an engineer here at Fort Defiance Industries. I'm talking about the P2131 sterilizer, and in this video we're going to talk about how to troubleshoot a vacuum leak test. So if you've run a vacuum leak test on the sterilizer and you're not passing it, these are some of the things you can check to hopefully fix the problem. When this thing runs a vacuum leak test, as you can see in one of the operational videos, it records the value of the vacuum, waits for 15 minutes, and then compares it to the value at the end of 15 minutes. So if you've lost any vacuum in the chamber, you will not pass that test. So when a vacuum is pulled, it's only pulled on the chamber and anything connected to the chamber. So all these things to check, all these parts to check, are different things that are attached to the chamber, like the door, the chamber pressure transmitter, any hoses connected to it. So before we get to that checklist, a good first check is if maintenance has recently been performed. That's the first thing you're going to want to check. So you're going to want to check that the correct sealant was used. So say you broke in and replaced a fitting down here, or replaced a fitting on top of the chamber. You're going to want to check that fitting, make sure it's tight, make sure the correct Loctite 567 sealant was used. You're going to want to make sure it's aligned correctly. Is the flow arrow in the correct direction? There's internal component diagrams in the manual that you can check all that stuff. Also, as I go through this checklist, this vacuum leak test troubleshooting guide is in the back of the manual, so you can reference that as we go through this. So, if you still have problems passing vacuum leak tests after you kind of check any items that maintenance was performed on, this list is in such a way that these should be your kind of easy things to check first, and we'll slowly get to harder things. So first of all, you're going to want to make sure the whole unit is visually tight. And the best way to do that is to run a cycle. And when you have steam in the chamber, say during exposure, if you run a wrapped instruments 1020, you're going to have 10 minutes to go around and check all your fittings with the panels off. You can check around the door. Sometimes a mirror helps. If you put a mirror, the steam would fog up the mirror and you could see that you potentially had a leak around the door. You can check around the door post right here, and then you can go around and check every fitting that's attached to the chamber. So you could check down here, the strain manifold is attached to the chamber, and then you could go on top and start to check all the other fittings. So that's the visual tightness check. And again, the best way to do it is to run a cycle, have the panels off. Please be careful, everything will be hot. Any fitting attached to the chamber will be very hot. So you may want to use gloves as you do that. Number two, you're going to check all the VCO hoses that the O-rings are placed in and that they're tight. So there's 3 hoses. You can see during the setup video and operational videos that there's the red, white, and blue tagged hoses. And on both ends, the VCO O-ring has to be in place, and this nut has to be tight. You don't have to tighten it more than 45 degrees once it's seated. But on the water recovery system end and the sterilizer main unit end, you're going to want to check that the VCO O-rings are in place, they're not damaged. If it wasn't fully seated and you tried to tighten the hoses, you may damage that O-ring. So it's very easy to loosen these, take them off, check all your O-rings, and make sure those are sealed up. Alright, so our manual vents in the back. We have the jacket and chamber. Again, we're only really interested in things that are attached to the chamber. So really the chamber manual vent valve is very important. So, if it was cracked loose, you would pull air in through the chamber vent and you could potentially lose your vacuum during that vacuum leak test. So you just want to make sure that's very tight right here so it can't pull air through during the vacuum leak test and lose your vacuum. Alright, next we're going to be talking about the door. So, if you open the door, the door O-ring right here. Very important. This O-ring will last a really long time unless you score it and scratch it with maybe a tray coming in and out. But other than that, it should last a very long time. It's made of EPDM rubber, so it's very resistant to steam and heat. But you may want to do, if you're not passing vacuum leak tests, you can get real close and just check for any scratches, tears in the O-ring. It should be well seated. It shouldn't be bulging out anywhere. But you know, this is what seals up the door, so that does have to be in good condition for this door to seal. Now this O-ring, when it is closed, when this door is closed, it seals on the door face. So the door face has to be free from gouges and scratches. So again, you can get really close. If your unit's on, this is going to be hot, so be careful. But you can go around the whole face, checking for deep gouges and scratches. That could be potential leak paths for steam, or during the vacuum leak test, air to get in. So you're going to want to check this silver face right here. Next is that the door can come out of alignment. So it's sitting on these hinges, and you're going to want to make sure that's well aligned. So with the door closed, you can compare the gap on the top and the bottom, and they should be pretty even. And if it was, hanging low and wasn't aligned well, you could get a potential leak from the O-ring not seating well on this door face. A little droop is okay if the door is drooping a little bit, no problem at all. We do align this here at the factory, but if you were drooping a little bit, you can pull off this hinge panel. There's 2 bolts. You can pull those bolts out, and there's some spacers that you can add or take away to adjust your door alignment. So you want to make sure your door is well aligned. Now, up here on the top, we'll come around here for our pressure transmitters. So, right here is your chamber pressure transmitter. This one's your jacket pressure transmitter. So again, we're not as concerned with the jacket pressure transmitter, but the chamber pressure transmitter, when vacuum is pulled on the chamber, vacuum is also pulled on this chamber pressure transmitter. So right where this fitting comes together, there's a copper gasket. If that copper gasket wasn't seated well, if this came loose, you could pull air through that fitting and you could lose your vacuum during that vacuum leak test. Also, this hose right here is connected to the chamber. So if your valve was damaged, if you bumped your valve, if you punctured it, you could potentially get a leak there. So again, we're interested just in the chamber components right here. So this is attached to the chamber right here on the top. Next, a few more things on the door. We do have our door post right here, and there's 3 bolts that attach the door post to the door plate. These could come loose during normal operation of the sterilizer as this door heats up, as it pressure up and flexes and cools. These can come a little loose. So you're going to want to check those and make sure they're torqued. These are torqued to 90 inch-pounds. And again, if those come loose, there's an O-ring behind here that may not be sealing as well. So you can take these 3 bolts out. You're going to kind of want to hold on to the locking mechanism. You can take off the retainer on the front with these 2 screws with an Allen wrench. You can pull the door post out and you can inspect that O-ring and make sure it's in good condition. If it's damaged, you may be leaking through the door post O-ring. So that should be everything for the door. All right. So that's going to be your first line of checks. Most of those are visual checks, very easy to check. There's a few other things that are a little more in depth. The first one of which is when the unit is at idle, and I'm pressured up here in the jacket, I'm around 30 psi. Be careful of everything being hot. But if you put your ear towards the chamber, if you heard any sizzling in the back of the chamber, what that would be is steam would be coming out of the jacket, going through the sterilized valve in the back, and then it would be condensing and leaking into the chamber. So when I'm sitting here idle, that valve should be completely closed. I should have no steam being able to leak through that valve. But if steam was able to leak through that valve, condense, and sizzle in the back of the chamber because it's hot, you'd be able to hear that right here, and that'd be an indicator that that valve was stuck open, that the valve seat was damaged, that something happened that allowed steam to leak through that valve. So if steam is leaking through that valve, during your vacuum leak test, a little bit of steam is going to leak through. It's going to add a little pressure to your chamber. You're going to lose vacuum, so you would not pass that vacuum leak test. So that's a good one to check. Again, you'll be able to hear it. And if you can hear it, you can perform maintenance on the sterilized valve, which is on the back top of the chamber. Alright, so here's the sterilized valve that I was talking about. And the flow arrow is towards the back of the sterilizer. And again, I was talking about the sizzling. If you hear that sizzling, this is the valve that is malfunctioning. So if it was stuck open ever so slightly, steam is going to come out of the jacket, start to condense in this tube, and then drip into the chamber and sizzle. So this is a very critical valve. You know, it's attached to the jacket and the chamber. Now, when you're listening close here to the chamber, you will be able to hear a boil in the jacket. So very easy to mistake the boil for the sizzling. The sizzling is pretty constant, and you're going to hear a tss, tss, tss. The boiling is just kind of, you know, just a bubbling noise there. So a little distinction between the boiling in the jacket of the water and steam and the sizzle of condensation dripping in the back. Also, we'll come around here to the vacuum brake valves. So right here we have the vacuum brake valves, and you can see with this hose, they're connected to the chamber through the chamber pressure transmitter assembly here. So whenever a vacuum is formed in the chamber and you need to open the door, you press vent, these valves open, allow air to be drawn in. So during a vacuum leak test, you want these to be closed. The most important valve to hold vacuum is the valve closest to the HEPA filter. So if this valve was stuck open, if it was installed incorrectly, this arrow on the bottom should be facing the other valve, so these arrows should always be facing each other. If anything happened that this valve was stuck open, air could be drawn through here and go into the chamber, and you would lose your vacuum. So these valves have to be operating correctly. And again, a good way to troubleshoot these is to take them apart, which we will show you here in a second in another video. But you can take them apart, you can inspect the valve seat, you can inspect the Teflon plunger that seals off, you can inspect the spring. A bunch of things you can kind of visually check very easily on these valves to make sure they're sealing correctly. Alright, so a few of the last things you can check if you're not passing a vacuum leak test. There are two check valves in the water recovery system that are very important for sealing off and passing vacuum leak tests. This is the condensate check valve, which if you follow the route, the hose goes through the steam trap, up through the red hose, which attaches to the chamber. So this check valve, when a vacuum is formed, it stops any backflow into the chamber. So if this is sealing off correctly, you're good, you're going to pass vacuum leak test. If this was leaking, if somehow it was jammed open, you could pull water, air, anything through this hose into the chamber and you would fail vacuum leak test. So you can actually take these apart, these two fittings on the sides, you can take them apart, and there's two O-rings that you can inspect. These are very durable. This is typically going to be a last thing you're going to check. And just like this condensate check valve right here, we have the vacuum exhaust check valve. So it's Doing the same thing, if you followed this routing, this connects back up to the chamber through the vacuum exhaust valve, and whenever a vacuum is pulled, this check valve seals off and prevents any backflow into the chamber. So again, if this was jammed open, it would allow some air, water, whatever, to backflow into the sterilizer main unit, the chamber, and it would prevent you from passing vacuum leak tests. So it can be taken apart, you can inspect the O-rings, you can make sure the little check is sealing. So these two check valves, kind of going to be a last thing you're going to check, but again, they are important for passing vacuum leak tests.